Hi, everyone. This is Courtney Hunt, and we are going to get started. So I'm going to give a little introduction, maybe 30 more seconds, wait on people to come in, and then I will set the stage for us. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Thank you so much for being here with us today. My name is Courtney Hunt, and I am the Art and Design Librarian here at The Ohio State University. We are super happy we were able to hold this event, which was originally scheduled for our Wikipedia Editathon, along with other internationally scheduled events for art and feminism. My co-moderator, Alex Adcock, is an undergraduate student in the Department of Arts Administration, Education, and Policy, and will be working for Art and Feminism on their 2021 campaign, along with serving as the Midwest Regional Ambassador for Art and Feminism. We will be planning another edit-a-thon in the spring, so please keep your eyes peeled for that and participate. Now for some brief housekeeping. To begin, we would like to acknowledge that the land the Ohio State University occupies is the ancestral and contemporary territory of the Shawnee, Potawatomi, Delaware, Miami, Peoria, Seneca, Wyandot, Ojibwe, and Cherokee peoples. Specifically, the university resides on land ceded in the 1795 Treaty of Greenville and the forced removal of tribes through the Indian Removal Act of 1830. We want to honor the resiliency of these tribal nations and recognize the historical context that has and continues to affect the indigenous peoples of this land. And there's a link in the chat if you want to know more about land acknowledgements and why we're doing one today. Next, I'd like to remind you that all attendees have been muted and videos are off. You are welcome to ask questions in the Q&A box. Chat will be used for general comments and discussion. We will read questions at the end of both speakers' talks. And for questions today, we will use what is referred to as progressive stacking to make sure that questions from Black, Indigenous, and people of color attendees are prioritized. So if you identify as a member of an underrepresented group, please place an asterisk in front of your question. A recording of today's webinar will be available within 10 business days. So let's get started. I'm going to turn it over to Alex.
Welcome, everyone. For the sake of time, I'm going to quickly introduce our first speaker, Carmen Winant. Carmen is the Roy Lichtenstein Endowed Chair of Studio Art at The Ohio State University, an artist, writer, and a 2019 Guggenheim Fellow in Photography. For more detailed bios of today's speakers, please visit the event registration page. Carmen, please go ahead and share your screen.
I have to unmute myself first before I do that. Okay, so I now no longer see anyone, but maybe you could give me a thumbs up or some sort of verbal affirmation that you can see what I see.
You're good.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so it is a pleasure to be here. And I'm so delighted to be not only sort of participating in this with everyone out there in virtual space, but alongside Professor Giselle Latorre, whose work is really so vast and impressive and politically meaningful. I'm going to launch right into it because we have just these 20 minutes, so I'll try to sort of adhere by that time frame and keep it relatively compact. I've made a few notes here, so I'll try to sort of refer to them while looking as much as I can at the green dot on my computer. So the topic today, of course, is a large one, and I decided to find a way into it by focusing on a central concern in my own work, which is, of course, a practice that I consider to be very much entangled, with the wants and contradictions of feminism, what I call here my racist visuality. So across these 20 minutes and through the lens of a specific project, My Birth, I'm going to talk about sort of what my way of working has really taught me about, in turn, about feminism, a life project that I ascribe to, a sort of, and work inside of, and sort of work to complicate and augment. And I have a lot of slides, but before I move through them, I just want to say too, that I'm going to be talking about representation today. And that's this word in art school that we use quite a lot. We use it in sort of superlative and often kind of metaphorical capacities for its sort of political potential, for the violence that it can inflict, for the meaning that it can generate. And, you know, I always thought, particularly as an art student, of representation as being removed from our subjectivities, right? Like by definition, it is a portrayal, a depiction, a likeness. And I always found myself, or I regularly found myself feeling sort of annoyed by the way, not just sort of the grandiosity that we assign to representation, but the ways in which we weaponized it. I might add, sort of, I'm the child of a social scientist and a reproductive health rights worker. And so like for them, there was no such thing as symbolism, right? It was all sort of, they lived within quantitative worlds. So for across the next 20 minutes, I want to sort of demonstrate how and why I changed course on that position and what I found that representation had to reveal to me about the world in which I was embedded, and its sort of tethers to real and realize life and death crises. So this is the aforementioned work that I'm going to be talking about as a kind of case study, if anything. This, as I mentioned, is a work from 2018 called My Birth that was a part of the new photo show at MoMA, installed, as you can see here, on two facing walls. It held really over 2,000 images, found representations, found likenesses, right? In every sense of the word, of women undergoing the process of labor and childbirth. And maybe I can sort of move through a few of these slides just as I descriptively account for the work and how it came together. As you can see, it pictures women in the continuum. So sort of, yes, pushing bodies out of their bodies, but also, experiencing contractions, experiencing sort of long, unfixed, ineffable period of middle labor, which of course is so hard, impossible to describe photographically through representation, which was part of the appeal and the interest in making this work and collecting these images, was sort of the limits of photographic representation, and at the same time, a sort of challenging of the visual vernacular, right? A sort of what is made representable in the first place, right? Like, how do these pictures circulate, if they circulate at all? Why do they feel so shocking? What is it to make a work that is politically salient in terms of, its representational currency? And so I was thinking about that as I collected the images, and I was thinking quite a lot about the flow of the studio and taping things up on the wall with this blue painter's tape so that I could see everything at once, and sort of like a functional approach to sort of to working in the studio that I could transmute in some direct sense into not just the gallery wall, but the gallery wall of MoMA, the sort of most hallowed of spaces. So as you can probably see, these are mostly white mothers, I would say. These are mostly white people. This is mostly white subjectivity. And maybe I can sort of forward, I'll stop here to say that I would never often sort of show this kind of thing, but it seems germane to this larger conversation, not just of sort of the idea of exclusion, but as I'll get to, sort of what that exclusion both reflects and reinforces in the world representationally. So these are two screenshots from, me posting a photograph of this installation on Instagram. And a friend of mine, Sune Woods, who actually spoke here through the Wexner last year, an artist based in LA, says, "Congrats, Carmen. Where are the POC?" And another friend who's a midwife, who's a Black midwife now living in Memphis, writes like, "Yes, where are these people?" Right? And they say it in the most loving and tender and sort of supportive ways possible. They say, I love you, I love this, this feels like an important work. And what's with all the white women? So here's some of the books I pulled from, one shot of many in the studio of some books of many, unless they are really designed specifically as books that sort of pivot around Black motherhood or Black subjectivity, and a few of them do. They do not take Black life into account, Black bodies and Black experience into account. I mean, I'm talking about books and books and books full of, you name it, breastfeeding, postpartum, active birth, water birth, home birth, that are full of white women. I mean, I'm talking like full of white women, right? Like, I don't mean that hyperbolically. I'm not going to belabor this too long because of, for the purposes of time, but it is worth stopping and pausing and sort of reflecting on sort of who is being pictured and for whom is receiving the material, right? Like how it circulates for whom. This movement, right, centered perhaps in our bodies ourselves, sort of all of the books that came to follow, and predated our bodies ourselves. In fact, I mean, you can see some well-known books in here like Ina May's Guide to Breastfeeding, The Womanly Art of Breastfeeding is a very well-known book. These are books that are designed to disseminate information about women to women, right? About the function of their bodies, about what their bodies look like, about what will happen during labor, about what will happen during an illegal abortion or whatever the case is. This is a kind of social alliance network, right? So who gets to be a part of that network is really important. It's really politically salient. So both in terms of sort of who is pictured, as I said, who does that picturing, and sort of who benefits from the circulation of those same pictures. So you can see that this here, an example, it's just one example of a very famous book, Spiritual Midwifery by Ina May Gaskin from 1975. I could be wrong about this, but I don't think this book holds a single image of a non-white person, or at least a non-white passing person. This is sort of what I think of as the sort of, like the image of the white mother, right? This sort of this woman whose body in and of itself is not politics, right? Doesn't have to be politics, can sort of just be about a kind of elevated, maternal status, right? And we see this all over the place, but particularly sort of in the case of, say, this woman like in the top left. I'm going to go through some examples here. I don't have things to say necessarily about these specific examples, except I hope that they point to the condition of whiteness that I describe, from books on, prenatal exercise, to, books about the process of labor, childbirth, and sort of the expectations therein, photographs, like these of bodies coming out of bodies, which were so sort of central, to the project, and which still sort of hold the project together in this really powerful way, to books on breastfeeding that are, all sort of close-ups on skin. I wrote a sort of short something here that I'm going to now read, although I've sort of thought and said versions of this along the line. The more I collected imagery, the more I confronted what was, of course, here all along, a lack of representation, a lack of visuality. There are almost no images of women of color, and I might add very few images of surgical births, non-vaginal births, and very few images of non-hetero couples. So for the first time, as I was moving through this project in a dedicated way, I understood that this lack of representation sort of not only reflected, but really perpetrated real world violence. This isn't a metaphor, in other words. Still, I have to acknowledge that my first thought was like, what's good for the project, right? Like, I want the project to feel well-rounded. I want the project to feel like it holds diverse experience. But of course, this is a bigger problem than my project, like this project or my project in a larger sense. This is a question of life and death. This is a question of self and dignity and safety. Um, I want to go back and say sort of one thing about this too. And we can see it even in a picture like this, which sort of, for the most part, hold no faces, or at least faces of mothers, that these are images, and I really had to confront this, and this is sort of borne out in the title of Racist Visuality. These are images of white motherhood, although it also isn't quite so simple, right? Like, I don't necessarily think of myself as a white mother or a Jewish mother or whatever else. I think of myself as a mother. And that's in part because I have the privilege to do so. But it's also because at 3 a.m., when when my baby is screaming or shitting or whatever, I'm not a metaphor, right? I'm a mother. I'm not a white mother. I'm a mother. I'm not a representation. I'm not a race. I'm a person in a body trying to calm another much more disoriented person in a much smaller body. But at the same time, it's both in between, right? Like, here we still are together in the world of representation in our whiteness. Around the same time, actually about 3 weeks after the show at MoMA opened, there was a cover story, a really important cover story in the New York Times Magazine that was photographed by Latoya Ruby Frazier, who just had an exhibition, of course, at the Wexner. And let me see if I can, it had at its center this then 23-year-old woman, Simone Landrum, who was a resident of New Orleans, who had suffered the loss of her full-term child, who was born as a stillborn. I think she had preeclampsia, which is a quite serious condition, but not uncommon, that was totally overlooked and dismissed by her doctors. And so the story that was photographed so tenderly by Latoya was sort of very much about this dismissal of Black women, again, sort of tethered to, our larger representation of them in culture, particularly in and around maternal health, but of course beyond, as well as the Black doula whom she was working with, who was advocating for her in this space. And, I'm going to talk about this photo in a second, but I might add just a statistic that probably most folks know here at this point, which is that it doesn't matter what your age is, it doesn't matter what your level of education is, it doesn't matter what your income bracket is. Like, even Serena Williams wrote about this, right? As a Black woman giving birth, Black women are 3 times more likely to die in childbirth than white women. I mean, think about that, right? Black infants in America are now more than twice as likely to die as white infants, which is actually a racial disparity. I learned this from this article, a racial disparity that is actually wider than in 1850, 15 years before the end of slavery, when Black women were considered chattel. One study analyzed in this article that's mentioned found that cesarean sections were 40% more likely amongst Black women compared to white women. So it goes on, right? And so this was such a sort of a meaningful and tender and trenchant approach to this topic, which sort of blew the lid open for a lot of people, myself included. What I'm showing you now is from a Eugene Smith Life photojournalistic essay from Life magazine that Latoya has said influenced her own sort of photographic doing in New Orleans all these years later. It pictures, as it says in the article, a 51-year-old healthcare provider who dedicated her life to serving patients in South Carolina. In fact, Callan described herself as a nanny midwife. And delivered thousands of babies on back roads of, as I've said, of rural South Carolina. She herself had 12 sisters and was orphaned by the age of 6. And so we can sort of see these images sort of side by side and understand their complicated, sort of inheritance, right? On the left, we have this photograph that is, honoring and centering Black midwives who arose, by the dozens when hospitals wouldn't take Black women, right? Or when they were too poor to pay, or when they didn't have access, you know, and on and on and on. Talk about sort of a lack of visuality, and yet at the same time is being photographed by like a quite famous white male photojournalist. So it's sort of interesting to see these photographs side by side, and to talk and to hear Latoya talk about sort of the bearing of and influence of Eugene Smith's seminal photo essay on her own work. Something else that sort of crossed my, you know, sort of crossed into my research, so to speak, as I was sort of probing around for sort of, you know, channels of representation as I was creating My Birth, was this film, All My Babies, A Midwife's Own Story by George Stoney, which was created as an educational film. And features Mary Frances Coley, who was a Black midwife from Albany, Georgia, right? A very similar story, delivered something like 3,000 babies in the middle of the 20th century. She herself was born a twin. Her twin did not survive. Her mother died in childbirth, right? Like these are all feel sort of very relevant, you know, sort of pieces of information that inform the story. This film is actually placed in the National Registry in the Library of Congress, again, made by a film sort of centering Black midwifery practice in the rural South, made by a white man. So I'm gonna sort of, I don't know where I am time-wise, but I'm probably nearing the end.
Got a couple more minutes, Carmen.
Okay, so I'll speed through and show you some of the images that did appear in the installation. Images like these of Black nurses and Black midwives, you know, with their patients, you know, images like these, which again sort of center Black women as, you know, those who are undergoing the experience of sort of maternal transformation. But of course, most of the images, and really this was the lion's share of them, featured Black women in the capacity of support staff. One other thing I'll note on this is a lot of the images that I was able to collect of women who were not white came from other countries like Zimbabwe, South Africa, Thailand, Papua New Guinea, and so forth. And there was like a real sense of like, look what these women of color do over there in other countries. Like, well, there are 24 million Black women in this country, right? Not that this was necessarily only rooted in North America. It was a curious point that the images of women of color that I could find were sort of for more anthropological studies, and not necessarily images like this, right? Images that were sort of afforded to so many white women of dignity, of tenderness, of, you know, of transformation. So I'm just going to sort of move through a few of the images that did appear in the installation, and also images that I have sort of continued to collect because it is a compulsion. And so I return then to the installation and the question of how to make presence out of absence, how to center refusal in and around representation, a refusal that not only works to deny subjectivity, but reinforce the consequences, the severe and not so subtle consequences of that same denial, how to work in this negative space, understanding that it itself, that kind of void, is representational of excess and of privilege. I have more to say, but I'm going to end it there for the purposes of time, and very happily will take questions, comments, and beyond.
Thank you so much, Carmen. Those images are incredible. And this is a really critical topic. I can't wait to hear what questions we get at the end. So now we are going to shift to Dr. Gisela Latorre. Dr. Latorre is a professor in the Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at The Ohio State University, and specializes in modern and contemporary U.S. Latinx and Latin American art, with a special emphasis on Chicana Latina feminism. We are so excited to have her today, and I'm very just excited to hand it over to you. So Dr. Latorre, if you could share your screen.
Thank you. First of all, can everybody see me?
Yep.
Yes.
Oh, Awesome, good. Just doing that quick tech check. I just wanted to start out by thanking Courtney, Christina, and Alex for organizing this and this incredible event, and for persevering after all the setbacks with the pandemic and, you know, and a whole bunch of other logistical issues. And so I just want to commend the three of you for doing such a fantastic job. And of course, I am so honored to be sharing this panel with Carmen Wynant, who is such an important artist, such an important feminist artist. And I feel that there's going to be a lot of kind of like common themes in our presentations. And so I'm going to start out by sharing my screen. And so I'm going to make sure I do this correctly. All right, can folks see my screen?
Yep, you're good to go.
Thank you, thank you. So my presentation, I'm titling it Chicana Feminist Murals of Resistance. And this presentation really reflects the part of the work that I've done on muralism for over 20 years now. And I want to talk about a kind of a mural movement that really encouraged us to rethink the public space, rethink also the gendering of public space, and what it meant for women of color to be present in these public spaces, doing murals and being active in this endeavor. And so I'm going to start out first by talking about what the term Chicana means. Is a term that really kind of emerges in the 1960s. It started out as a derogatory term to refer to people of Mexican or Mexican American background. And it's a term that in the wake of civil rights, in the wake of all the political activism that was happening in the 60s and 70s, it was a term that became embraced, and it became resignified. It was no longer derogatory, but it referred to a Mexican American who was politically active, who was aware of the history of colonization, the history of racism in this country, and who committed to to create spaces of social justice. And that movement is usually called the Chicano movement. And so the term Chicana, then with an A at the end, also meant that you were committed to gender equality. And so Chicana was an identity that really signaled a commitment to kind of intersectional social justice, as they were aware that as working class women of color, they were subjected to multiple and overlapping forms of oppression. And so with the rise of the Chicano movement, we see a rise of the arts, whether it was visual art or whether it was literature, theater. Many Chicano or Chicanx activists began to think of art as a tool to promote ideas about social justice. And so a committed Chicanx artist would not be engaged in the practice of art for art's sake, but rather would engage in a form of artivism, where art was part of an activist kind of sensibility. And what was very important for Chicana artists was representation. And Carmen talked about representation as this important notion when it comes to gendered and racialized bodies, right? That, that representation becomes inherently a political act, because if you think about the history of representation of people of color, and Carmen talked about the erasure of women of color, and I think that Chicana artists were also thinking about their own erasure in history books, their own erasure even among the ranks of the Chicano movement that were very male-centered. And so muralism became a means by really making your representation monumental. And so how radical it was then for Chicanas to go into this public sphere, into the streets, these places that were kind of meant to be more male-centered, but also these spaces that that they were not supposed to be. If they were good Catholic girls, it was not good to spend all this time on the streets. And I'm talking about the 60s and 70s. And so murals also helped with the erasure of Chicanx artists in galleries and museums. Museums were not showing this work. And so the streets became a kind of an alternative space to represent their work, to represent, who they were as artists. So I want to share a few images to kind of document a little bit the history of Chicana muralism. And one of the earliest proponents of Chicana mural art was the collective known as Mujeres Muralistas. This is a collective that emerges in the Bay Area in the early 70s, and it was composed primarily by Chicana artists, but it included also a Venezuelan artist. And for them to just be outside, be standing on scaffolding, which is, those structures that you build to create murals, that in itself was a very political act. However, and being women of color. And they were very much active in the Mission District, in San Francisco's Mission District. But a lot of times their work was deemed especially by male artists, male Chicano artists, was deemed to be apolitical because they were not talking about gang violence. They were not talking about Aztec warriors. They were not talking about police brutality or the Vietnam War and how so many Chicanos were dying in the Vietnam War. Those were the themes that were believed to be worthy of representation in murals from the perspective of the male Chicanos. But what you see in this mural called Fantasy World for Children is a different kind of image. It's supposed to be an image that primarily was geared toward women and children. It was located in a park. And it shows this fantastical landscape with indigenous people, with a very diverse flora and fauna. And the idea was that they wanted to create this kind of imaginary decolonial utopia for children to imagine, right? And for children to also see people who look like look like them. And so you can see images of children here. And so what you see with Las Mujeres Muralistas, which in Spanish translates to the women muralists, is the creation of murals that were meant to speak to audiences who were often not seen as, as people who were deserving of, of communication in a sense, which is primarily women and children. And so Las Mujeres Muralistas really, set the standard and allowed in many ways for other Chicanas to begin hitting the streets and doing mural work. And one of those important Chicana artists was the artist Judy Baca, who becomes active in the 1970s. And Judy Baca is known for many, many works. She's also known for helping fund mural initiatives throughout the Los Angeles area and California. But one of her most well-known works is the Great Wall of Los Angeles, which is a mural that is actually painted on a flood control wall, and it's almost half a mile long. And what the mural does is that it depicts the history of Los Angeles from the perspective of people of color. So in this mural, you see African-American history, you see Chicano history, you see Native American history, and thank you for the land recognition, Courtney, by the way. You see, queer history. And so what this mural shows us is a history of Los Angeles that is kind of non-hegemonic, that is not the history that you might think is part of the city. And what was also important about this mural is that it included the participation of over 400 at-risk youth. And so what Judy Baca kind of established is not just the idea of murals as a collaborative practice, but also murals as a way to reach out to young people. to empower young people, to make young people proud that they were part of something that was collaborative, and that was also meant to kind of be empowering for them. And in the process, they learned a lot about the history of their own cities that they didn't get, for example, in their high school history classes. So for example, part of this mural, let's see if you can see it, were events such as the division of the barrios in Chavez Ravine. And this refers to the construction of Dodger Stadium, which resulted in the division of a predominantly Mexican-American neighborhood. And many of the residents were actually removed from the area by force to make way for the building of the stadium. And so not many people knew about the history behind this, you know, this famous stadium. Or other elements, other scenes that you see in this mural also is the deportation of Mexican Americans after the Great Depression. And this kind of scapegoating of Mexican Americans, almost blaming them for the economic problems that the United States was going through in the 1930s. And of course, these images were done, you know, 40, even more, even close to 50 years, not 50, not so much, but over 40 years ago. And you see that the continued relevance, right? You know, we still are, you know, in this place where we're scapegoating certain populations, blaming them, you know, especially racialized populations, blaming them for the problems that we currently have. And you see our president blaming, you know, China, or blaming the immigrants, right? And so in many ways, this mural continues to be very relevant. But it, you know, the Great Wall of Los Angeles was so important because of the, not just the images and the creation of alternative histories, using public murals to create these alternative histories, but also the actual process, the actual collaborative process, the outreach process that was so important to the Great Wall of Los Angeles. What was also important when Chicanas were doing murals was to expand the idea of the roles that women can play in social movements and the roles that they can play in society at large. During the Chicano movement in the 1970s, a lot of the women who were participating in the movement were expected to do kind of like traditional domestic tasks. They were expected to make coffee for the male revolutionary. They were even expected to, you know, to provide them with sexual favors. And so creating images of Chicanas that included numerous roles that they could play was really important, because their, you know, their image in society at large was very limited, and their image in society among the Chicano movement was also very limited. So images such as these, called Mujer by Judith Hernandez, shows us Chicanas playing these various roles as activists, as mothers, as indigenous women who have roots in a lot of Mexico's native populations, also play, you know, participating in spirituality. So you see kind of like an image of La Virgen de Guadalupe here. You see this, you know, of course, the Chicana getting educated. So you see here a college diploma. And so creating this diversity of roles and possibilities for Chicanas was really important. And you can imagine, you know, how what impression it would have caused on the young working class Chicanas who lived in Ramona Gardens, which is a predominantly Mexican Chicano neighborhood in Los Angeles. You know, what impression a mural like this would have made on them. And of course, what was also very important is to put women at the center of social movements, at the center of activist initiatives. And so with this piece called Uprising of the Mujeres, Uprising of the Women, we see this woman who is a very kind of badass activist. She is lunging forward. She is holding the meager wages that she earns as a farm worker. And she is very confrontational. She really challenged the notion of Chicanas as being passive, as being almost like the Virgen de Guadalupe, asexual, and, you know, with her eyes kind of downcast. And so creating images of women as, you know, assertive and active participants in social movements was also really important. And if we get a chance, you know, I'd be happy to talk about how Judy Baca studied the work of Mexican muralist David Alfaro Siqueiros. And she used a little bit of his approach to perspective in this mural. So what was very much central to the Chicano movement was the struggle of the United Farm Workers, the UFW. And for those of you who might be familiar with the UFW, this is of course a very important labor union that was founded by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. And it was a labor union that really sought to what is the word that I'm looking for? To unionize farm workers. And these farm workers were perhaps the most disenfranchised workers in the United States, even though they worked for a very profitable business, which is the California agricultural business. But these folks, you know, were paid meager wages. These folks were working under inhumane conditions. And so it was really important for a lot of artists, both Chicana and Chicano artists or Chicanx artists, to really expose the dangers of, you know, of being out there in the fields. And so in this mural by a Bay Area Chicana artist called Las Lechugueras, or the lettuce pickers, we see an image of women working in the fields, Chicanas and Mexican-American women working in the fields, picking lettuce. And above them, you see the crop dusters flying right above them and spraying really harmful pesticides right on top of them. And the result of this exposure to the harmful chemicals would result in numerous health problems. And so here we see that that injustice being represented in this public mural. And I want to underscore or show you here one of the figures, one of the women working, who is also visibly pregnant. And so the message here is that these harmful pesticides are not just going to harm them, but they're also going to have negative effects on, you know, on her unborn baby. And so murals are playing the role of exposing the social ills and the social injustices that have affected brown people in this country. What is also, I think, important to the history of Chicana feminist murals of resistance is the willingness of collaborating and creating coalitions. And this is something that you saw, of course, with the work of Judy Baca in the Great Wall of Los Angeles, where she's collaborating with young people. But in this mural called Maestra Piece, we see a collaboration between Chicana artists, but also with artists of other backgrounds. So in this mural in San Francisco's Mission District is the result of a collaboration really across difference. So we have here African-American women, women artists, Asian American women artists, Jewish American women artists who collaborated together with Juana Alicia and Irene Perez in this piece called Maestra Piece. It's a really, really beautiful and stunning mural. And I want to kind of show you, and I know I just have like a minute or so left, but I wanted to show you one of the facades of the mural. And what the mural did is that it represented a history of the world, really, putting particular emphasis on the contributions of women. And so you see here actual historical figures being represented. You see Jocelyn Elders, you see Georgia O'Keeffe, and you see on the top of the mural the image of Rigoberta Menchú, the Guatemalan indigenous activist who spoke about the atrocities committed against Maya indigenous people in Guatemala. And so we see here, and let me get to the detail here. We see Rigoberta Menchú wearing her traditional Maya attire. We see this little curly cue coming out of her mouth, which is a speech scroll implying that she's in the process of speaking. And of course, her voice is what made her such an important figure, because she wrote this book called I, Rigoberta Menchú, where she talked about her family's history with the state-sponsored violence in Guatemala. On her hands, she holds two deities, two goddesses. One is Yemaya, the Yoruba goddess of rivers and waters. And on her other hand, she is holding Coyolxauhqui, the Aztec moon goddess. And the artist here, Irene Perez, basically took this image from an old Aztec stone of Coyolxauhqui, who had been dismembered in a fight against her brother, Huitzilopochtli, the god of war. And this ancient Aztec stone shows the aftermath of that violent confrontation. But as you can see here, the artist has pieced her back together, has created a kind of like a Coyolxauhqui 2.0, and she's now an artist and she's breaking away from the stone. So it's a really wonderful historical inclusion in this mural. But I shall stop here. I know that I'm out of time, and I am happy to engage in conversation with all of you. Oh my goodness, over 100 participants. I'm so excited. And of course, have a conversation with Carmen. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. LaTorre. That was fascinating. I want to thank both of our speakers for coming today and giving so generously of their time and energy in this way. I'm overwhelmed because I love hearing you both talk, and there's just so much to unpack here. So we are going to start with questions. There's a couple already, but if you have any, feel free to put them in the Q&A. Again, we are doing our progressive stacking. So if you identify as Black, Indigenous, or a person of color, please put an asterisk before your name so that we can prioritize your question. I am going to, yes, so Na Derma-Corley actually made a comment about during Carmen's presentation about medical anthropology. And I think that it's pretty established that medical anthropology is very racist. So I want to ask that question to Carmen, and just if not, if you want to elaborate, feel free to put that in the chat. And yeah, so I guess our first question is to you, Carmen.
Is the question in the chat? I'm not sure where to find the question.
Well, the question came in as a comment that just said, this is what medical anthropology is all about. So I wonder if you just want to speak on that a little bit.
Where to begin? Yeah, I mean, I guess the thing that comes to mind sort of in my field is the work of Doreen Garner, which if you don't know it, I would highly sort of recommend, you know, sort of you moving into, which is quite grisly and sort of quite actually difficult to look at by design. And I'm thinking here about sort of her work into not just anthropology, but gynecology, and sort of thinking about how Black women's bodies were used in such, I mean, unbearably painful ways, you know, akin to how we would think of Jews being used, you know, in terms of eugenics experiments. So her work is so sort of moving and singular to that end. I'm not quite sure how to sort of take on that question. It's a really meaningful one. It's a big field. It's adjacent, of course, to sort of my work as a visual artist, but it overlaps as I think about, I mean, I would say racist tendencies, but that's sort of too light-footed, isn't it? Right? The ways in which people die, the ways in which sort of bodies are dismissed, the ways in which pain is not taken seriously, the ways in which, you know, the color of our skin determines the kind of sort of healthcare we get and the dignity, you know, afforded to us in that process. So I'm not sure what to say to that, except yes, I see you, and it informs sort of my own thinking and my own research. Yeah, and it's sort of it's a meaningful conversation and sort of reinvestigation to, you know, to undertake.
If I can follow up with what Carmen said, so thank you for saying that. And one of the things that I talk to my students about in class is about just medical discourse in general, and to kind of, and I think that your work is kind of challenging the notion of objectivity around medicine, but also to deal with like the legacy of like testing on women of color. And so a lot of times we think, for example, of the birth control pill as, you know, something that has been so liberated for women. It allows women to take control over their reproductive health. But at the same time, this is a drug that was tested on Puerto Rican women, and a lot of times without their consent and with negative medical consequences. And so how do we contend? Or like, you know, the so-called, I'm forgetting his name now, the so-called father of gynecology, who did horrific experiments on Black women who were enslaved. So, but yet we benefit today from his advances. So how do we think about that also? So I was looking at your work and I was thinking about that. I was thinking about what, you know, how do we contend with discourses around medicine and bodies and racialized bodies? So.
Yeah, really well said. Better said than I could have. Thank you.
Thank you both.
You. This is a question from Sophia Dumont. I think both Gisela and Carmen can speak to this, but how can we make presence out of absence in American society? And in terms of whiteness, how can white women be proactive? Big one.
Big one, an important one. I mean, it's the center of everything. And there's a couple of different ways that I could approach it. And yeah, I too would be really interested in, you know, Professor Latore, what you have to contribute to this. And I mean, I can start by describing a kind of imperfect system that I have come up with, which is to talk about it and refuse to stop talking about it, so that if I'm given an opportunity like this one, that I center this discourse, this problem, you might call it, although that's not really a big enough word, that I talk about it in, you know, in the audio tour that attends that MoMA piece, you know, so that 10,000 people can hear me talking about it, so that it goes into the wall didactics, so that I talk about it in every interview. But, you know, I say that's imperfect because that's not necessarily like a registration in the work. It's just kind of a scaffolding for the work, right? It's the language that describes or sort of holds up or amends the work, but in a really essential way is not the work. And so I've come in and out of using images at all, in fact, because of this, or sort of making text-based pieces because it's a way to circumnavigate the problem of representation. But I sort of continually find myself sort of returning to the sort of that very problem for all of its contradictory promise, and maybe sort of moving into the other part of your question and sort of thinking about my own subjectivity in doing so. I mean, part of the reason I showed those two examples from the comments in Instagram is because those were two women of color. So women of color, of course, who are commenting, where are the women of color? And sort of thinking about what is my function here, not just as the person who is to sort of talk about this. I mean, again, I'm using words like lapse as if that's a bit, you know, a big enough word. The sort of perpetual omission that, again, sort of isn't just a reflection of, but, you know, a long-standing way to reinforce profound inequity and dismissal. So, you know, I think about, am I the right person to make this work? right? And sort of what does critical allyship mean and look like? And if I'm making a work that holds, I'm making up this number, but 90% white or white passing women, am I perpetuating the violence of representation that I'm describing? So like, these are all innate contradictions, you know, that I'm like trying to unravel perpetually with the work. So I wouldn't purport to sort of have the answers except to say that the problem has to sort of be perpetually surfaced in and around the discourse.
Yeah. I mean, I just want to echo a lot of the things that Carmen was saying. And I want to start with, again, the problem of representation, in particular when it comes to, you know, gendered and racialized bodies. I think that as I was looking at your work, Carmen, I was just thinking about how in those books where you know, about birthing and about, you know, mothering, and how, you know, there was hardly any women of color. And so that gave me this notion that motherhood was being defined inherently as whiteness, and that women of color did not figure into the definition of motherhood. And so I think that there's a lot to say about absence. And I think that when I see your work, Carmen, I think that it is an opportunity to talk about absence, and that absence gives us a lot of information. It begs us to ask, like you were asking, you know, why are the women of color not there? And so absence is, you know, I guess I invite people to really mine why those absences are there. And so that's something that I was just thinking about when you were talking and sharing your work with us, Carmen. And the other thing that I think in terms of this question, the imperfection that you were also talking about, Carmen, also made me think of how difficult representation and visibility it is for women of color. And so if you think back to the muralists that I talked about, the Chicanas who were doing you know, and continue to do this incredible, very hyper visible murals that people see on a day-to-day basis who walk through those streets. And so that's I think that's a really powerful response to their you know, their history of erasure, right? Their realization that they are excluded from all these, you know, forms of representation. They are excluded even from definitions of womanhood. But I also think of how difficult representation and visibility is for example, trans women of color who, you know, where we see this increased visibility of them in the media. You know, people like Janet Mock, or I'm blanking out on the other activists, really well known. Oh, Laverne Cox, right? But also we see this rise in the murders of women trans women of color. And so, you know, is visibility and representation something that as a trans person that you want? Or that because at the same time it makes you vulnerable, it puts you in this space of you know, of danger. And then the other part of the question, which is about, you know, like white women, I think that there has to be obviously a larger reflection on white privilege, and if you you know, and how white privilege really, you know, provides opportunities that women of color don't have. And so so it's really important to you know, and if you think about like how white women voted in the last election, I think that it's a moment for white women to really reflect that, you know, how their lives a lot of times depend on the subordination of women of color, or even people of color in general. And so that realization, I think, needs to happen, and that deep reflection about privilege. And I mean, we all reflect on our privilege. Even as a woman of color, I have a lot of privilege. I'm a professor. I'm an immigrant who doesn't have to worry about, you know, about ICE, about the persecution of, you know, immigration authority. So I also have a lot of privilege, but I think that we have to, I think the call for white women is really reflect on that privilege and think about how you can, act understanding that you have opportunities that other folks don't have. So that's kind of like maybe where I wanted to take that respond, or how I wanted to take my response to that question. Thank you.
Yeah, so we are at 3 o'clock, but we have a few more questions. So I want to ask our panelists, are you comfortable staying on for a few minutes? And those who want to stay and hear the answers to the questions can, or do you need to?
It works for me. My children may barge in any minute, as you can see.
Hey, this is about feminism, right?
Yes, but I'm here and available.
Okay.
I love when kids barge in and their Zoom calls.
Okay,
Mine is not because she's 18.
Okay. All right, so we'll go ahead and ask the next question. We have 3 more questions. I think this one might not be a terribly long answer. It's for Carmen from Sonia Fix. It says, I identify with a sense of nostalgia to the images with liberation from my own white and Jewish mother's feminist and women's health texts that I grew up viewing. And I'm so glad that you are acknowledging the limits of these publications, so many viewed as liberatory. Dr. Latoya, you did this as well. And by proxy, the limitations of a white feminist lens. Did you notice the absence of Black women and other women of color while you were creating the birth, My Birth, or was this something the lens of your Black friends drew you to?
Yeah, well, hi, Sonia, first of all, and thank you for that that thoughtful question. Oh, it just disappeared. Is it in? Oh, there we go.
It's in the answered one.
I can call it up.
Sorry about that. Click on
Reference. I mean, I wanted to start by acknowledging that feminism, like so many progressive social movements, is contradictory, right? Like it has tremendous promise, tremendous sort of made tremendous liberatory gains. And there is an enormous part of sort of, my life and my life's work that is dedicated to honoring that and sort of celebrating it and holding it up and sort of turning it over, thinking about my legacy and my inheritance, and sort of that which I owe, to the bravery of others. So, I don't want to be sort of only dismissive towards a movement that I admire, like with my whole being. And at the same time, and I only sort of alluded to this because of the time, constraint of 20 minutes, it is an enormous, the promise of feminism, once called women's liberation, is enormously contradictory. And I won't be like surprising anyone in this Zoom room, I imagine, by talking about the ways in which it was classist and racist, namely, Professor Latoya referred to this, and as it's been written about by so many, in particular, feminists of color and womanist scholars, like who is taking care of your children while you're marching? Who's taking care of your children while you're writing this feminist text? Who's cleaning your house, right? Like, who is holding you up? And so, I mean, there's so many ways to talk about that, but that has been that, contradiction has been, again, that's not necessarily limited to the feminist movement, but to so many progressive social movements, as Professor Latoya was talking about, that, that women in Black power should be, or like the women of the Black Panthers should be, the ones making breakfast, for the men, and to be having as many babies as possible, or whatever the case is. This isn't news, but for me, it's a sort of perpetual question of how to attend to it representationally, right? Like, how do you make presence of absence? How do you consider a contradiction in and as your visual work? And to this question of my racist visuality, I wanted to claim that as mine, right? Like, it's not something that I'm sort of pointing to from afar. It's something that I inherit and also perpetuate. And so this is a long-winded way of saying that it is, it's really messy, and the messiness is sort of what is the engine of the work. To your actual question, it's not, it was already very much sort of at the heart of the work. It was the problem of the work, and I mean that in the most generative sense, before I started My Birth. but it was augmented. And working on that project for a year was like holding a magnifying lens, up to the problem of whiteness, let's call it. It's privilege, it's violence, it's assumptions, it's sort of self-centering. And so that was something that, yes, I came into the MoMA immediately and said, we have to put this wall text and I have to talk about this, in the audio tour, as I mentioned. But yeah, it is curious and meaningful to point to the fact that, it was my two Black friends, on Instagram. Sorry, that's weirdly put. That's not to suggest that I only have two Black friends, that my Black friends were that those two folks were the ones who pointed to it. One of them who herself became a doula and then a midwife, in the past 5 years, and has dedicated her life to this project. So that's maybe a long-winded way of answering that question, but there's no short-winded way of answering it because it's so complicated, right? It's perpetually unresolvable.
So I have some follow-up questions from Na Drummer-Corley about medical anthropology. I don't think they're necessarily answerable, but just voicing the frustrations of racism that exist within medical anthropology. So I'll also just paste that in the chat so you both can read it. But why is this so hard? Can't we just send more doctors over to underrepresented groups who need the care? Why should the color of your skin determine your health care? Do doctors who base their care on the color of their patient's skin face any consequences, or they get to walk freely like nothing happened?
Do you want to take this?
Thank you, Nadromo, for that comment. But I'm not a public health specialist, and so I am not one to speak. But I thought, in my own kind of ignorant position on the medical fields, I do think that there has to be more dialogue. And in particular, now that we're having these public dialogues about healthcare, about repealing Obamacare, and really thinking about how these issues of access are going to affect our communities of color. And so it's very complex, and it has a lot of problems in many kind of parts of it, in terms of like whether it's the access, whether it's the doctors, whether it's the bias that doctors can exhibit. There's so much there that needs to be done. That's my kind of like my perspective on it.
Okay, so we have a question from Miranda Holmes, and I think this is going to be our last question because that'll probably get us ending around 1:15, and it's probably a good amount of time if everyone feels okay about that. Miranda Holmes asks, thinking about places of refusal or absence in the work of Carmen, Carmen presents, are there places of ambiguity / refusal / slippage of representation or narrative in the murals Dr. Latorre presents? And I'll leave the question up for you.
Mm-hmm. So refusal, ambivalence, is that, I'm sorry, I missed that part of the question.
Yeah, are there places of ambiguity, refusal, or slippage of representation or narrative in the murals that you presented?
So I think, yes, I think that there is a sort of a place where Chicana artists are kind of struggling with notions of identities that may be too static, and so especially in the place of collaboration with other women of color, how do you represent your identity in ways that are open, and that also kind of reflect the bordered sorts of experiences that women of color have. And so I think that that's a place where you see that the investment also on indigenous, because a Chicana identity is also one that embraces, the indigenous heritage of Mexican descent people, but at the same time, does it become too much of an appropriation, right? So if you look at the mural with the Coyolxauhqui, the indigenous moon goddess in San Francisco. Is this an appropriation of an indigenous experience that is very different from the experiences of Chicanas? And there's been some really lively dialogues between some Chicana feminists and Native American feminists who have problems with the ways in which Chicanas, but also the men, deploy indigenous imagery in not just in their work, but also in their activist discourse. So that's a place where you get that ambiguity, that slippage, that makes it also exciting, and it's a source of a lot of important dialogue. So that's what I would say about the work that I presented.
Okay, Carmen, do you have anything that you want to say, follow up, or are you good?
I think I'm good. I mean, I learned a lot, and I neglected, Professor Latorre thanked you all beforehand. I neglected to do that. So I want to also thank you and also commend you for persevering. I know that there were various setbacks, none of them sort of owing to your own programming and coordination. So thank you for sticking with it and for having us.
Yeah, thank you both for your time, seriously, and being flexible with rescheduling. It's been a pleasure. We've got a bunch of thank yous in the chat from various people, so please take a look at those. Yeah, I just want to thank you again to all of our attendees who came. Thanks for being part of this, and for those of you who asked questions. If you'd like to follow up, both Dr. Latorre and Carmen's emails are in the chat, and feel free to email me as well, hunt.877 at osu.edu, or reach out to Alex as well. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.